Progress. Good morning, people. Today we are to be spoken to by our friend Clive Burlton, who has an interesting subject, which I think will intrigue and interest numerous people. So Clive, whenever you're ready.
Okay, lovely. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the thank you to Patsy for we got there in the end, Patsy, didn't we?
Yeah, we made it.
Well done. Yeah, we're there. Okay, this is I'll just call it up and there. You can maybe give me a thumbs up to make sure it's on your screens, okay? Yeah.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Well, this is a subject about my wife's grandfather, a chap called George Pine, who almost exactly 50 years ago, in 1972, passed away. And when his elderly person's bedroom was cleared in Greystoke Avenue in Southmead, my brother-in-law came across his manuscript that he knew he was writing his life story, but George refused to show his manuscript to anyone until he'd finished. Well, he didn't quite finish, but he did actually write 44,000 words, handwritten words, in his foolscap folder. And my brother-in-law gave me that manuscript probably in the year 2000. It's one of those occasions when you're between employers. So I was on garden leave for about 3 months. And so I set about researching George's story from his words. And the hardest thing to start with was actually getting it typed up. And then once it was typed up in a Word document, so it was you could manipulate it, you could search it. But George never remembered things in chronological order. There was no chapterization. It was just, if you like, a brain dump of his life. So the hardest thing to start with, once it was typed up, was to try to put it in some semblance of order, which I eventually did. I chapterized it, and I brought out the book Trenches to Trams. You can see the front cover there, back in 11 years ago, in 2011, to coincide with the opening of the Shed Museum, where George's story is told very briefly by the green low-decker bus on the ground floor of Shed. So you can see his medals and other ephemera related to his story. So that's the background of it. So it's my wife's grandfather, and it took me off and on about 10 years of research to go through George's story. And I'll talk to you about the sort of trials and tribulations along the way. But George is George was born in 1891, and his mum died 2 years later, or 18 months later, in 1893, when she gave birth to her 5th child, Tom Pine. And from that first family, as George always referred to his siblings, there were 4 brothers and a sister. And so this story predominantly brings in those 5 children that I've researched as well as part of this sort of journey, really. 2 years after Mary Jane passed away, George's father, Charles Pine, remarried in 1895, and with his second wife had another 7 children. So you've got 5 children and 7, so you've got 12 children living in 2 houses actually next to each other. They were renting in Easton in Bristol. And here's a couple of George's brothers and sisters from his second family, so from the group of 7, outside number 16 and 18 Charles Street in Easton. And sadly, I didn't have these photographs when I produced the book, because they have subsequently been discovered in a photograph album in Auckland, New Zealand. Yes, exactly. So so that was great to find a connection with somebody who actually bought my book, or actually picked it up from the reference library in Bristol, realized he was his mother was one of the children in this photograph, and put two and two together and twigged he was part of this family. But George, given the family hardship at the time, and this is a lovely image of what Stapleton Road looked like just round the corner from where the Pines lived in the early 1900s. George's mother or stepmother and father requested of the Bristol Education Committee if George could leave school a bit early. So in those days it was age 14, but he had permission to leave at age 13 so that he could help to put some money on the family table. He worked in a clothes shop in Castle Street in Bristol, a grocer's up in Cheltenham Road in Bishopston, and he worked at the railway depot at St Philip's, shoveling hot coal and coke for the local railway company, Midland Road Railway Company. But he wanted to sort of better himself, so he actually joined his father's company. And I only found this out when I quizzed the 1921 census, which came out recently. I knew he was working in Portland Square, but until I examined the census, I didn't know it was for George Nash and Sons, one of about 7 or 8 boot and shoe companies in Portland Square at that time. There are about 10,000 people working in the boot and shoe trade in Bristol, mostly Kingswood, St George, and in the central areas where this was. So George became a useful lad, as he described it, going from bench to bench, like you can see these Bristol school children or young apprentices in the boot and shoe trade in Bristol, going from bench to bench, helping the more experienced boot and shoe operatives to do their work. He also followed in his father's footsteps because his dad, Charles, was a cornet player with the 3rd Volunteer Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment. In 1908, the Territorial Forces Act came into being to put the territorial forces on the same sort of structure as the regular army. So in the event of conflict, it would be simpler to mould the territorials into the regular army. In June 1908, George became a bugler with the 6th Gloucestershire Battalion up at St Michael's Hill. So this image here is the top of St Michael's Hill, and the building was destroyed during the Blitz in 1941, and is now the site of St Michael's Hospital, the former Bristol Maternity Hospital. So just to orientate you where this was. But this was the a photo from the First World War period. George loved to go on territorial camps, and all the territorial soldiers were part-time. They'd meet at weekends, they'd come on parades during the week, but they all had their day jobs. So basically they would meet up, and they'd also attend camps, for example. This was, George is pictured on the far left with a bugle in his hand. And this was the territorial camp on Salisbury Plain in the summer of 1908. Lovely image of the young lads, and they used to really love their camps where they did all sorts of exercises and drills. Yeah, so he really enjoyed it. And this photograph, as most in my book, were never part of the Pine family collection. I started off with absolutely 0 images, and I ended up with about 1,200 digital photographs from my research, not only in this country, but researching George's story in France and Belgium as well. And this particular image I found in the private collection of a chap called Andy Stevens. And Andy runs a lovely military memorabilia shop in Lower Park Row. If you come up past Colston Hall, as it was once called, up Colston Street, you've got Christmas steps on your left. You've got that crossing at the top of Christmas steps. Hang a right into Lower Park Row, and you'll find Andy's shop there. And he's a great Bristol militaria historian, as I found out. And this was one of 3 photographs of George I found in Andy's private collection that weren't in the family collection anywhere. So this is the camp in 1908. Sadly, a few years later, in 1910, George's stepmother passed away, not long after this particular photograph was taken. And this shows Charles Pine, George's father, and the 7 children from his second marriage. So here's all of George's step or half brothers and sisters in 1910. And again, this photograph emerged from an album in New Zealand. And on Charles Pine's left knee sits his daughter Amy. And it was Amy's grandson who twigged he was part of this family, and hence how these images have subsequently come to life. So that's lovely. Well, that was 1910. Unfortunately, her death caused quite a bit of ructions in the family. And bearing in mind, Charles now has got 12 children to help to look after. So there was some trouble and strife on the family front. Edith, from George's first family, she became a domestic servant in Julius Road in Bishopston. Fred was quite a naughty boy when he was a youngster, and at aged 11, he was so unruly, he used to sleep rough, and his stepmother and father really didn't know where he was from day to day, really. And he even stole the rent money from his father's, from the kitchen table. He was caught stealing sweets in a shop in Eastville, and he came in front of the Bristol Police Court for the third time as an 11-year-old. And the court said, enough's enough, we're sending you away to a reformatory. So he was sent to a reformatory at aged 11 for 5 years, after which he joined the army in Pontypool. Tom was so fed up at home, he actually left and was lodging in the army recruitment office in Colston Street, from which he joined the Border Regiment in Carlisle, a long way from Bristol. Amy, the young daughter I mentioned just now, she was supposedly being looked after by an auntie in South Wales, but was badly beaten and brought back home by Charles Pine, her father. And poor old Ethel was actually given away. No social services in those days. Charles Pine had friends in an adjoining street in Easton, and Ethel was adopted by them and grew up with other parents. So that was what was happening within that part of the family. George continued to go on his continued in the boot and shoe trade, continued to enjoy these camps. And this is a photograph which was in the family collection. George sat down in the middle, just here in the middle, with his bugle, and that's a Conway camp in 1912. 2 years later, 2nd of August 1914, all territorial forces across the country went on their summer camps. And this is an image of the North Hill, I think, or North Common down at Minehead, with the 6th Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment, which George was actually on this camp, and also the 4th Battalion of the Gloucesters. The day later, the day after arriving at camp, the camp was struck. That means that Colonel Woodcock, the commanding officer of the 6th Gloucester, said, right, we're returning to Bristol. And clearly there was bad news coming from the continent. 4th of August, Britain declared war on Germany the day later. And the scene at the top of St. Michael's Hill was like this. So this is a few days after George returned from the Minehead camp. He would have been in this photograph somewhere. So that this is basically the 6th Gloucesters, the territorials based at St. Michael's Hill during mobilization. So basically they're signing up, they're picking up their rucksacks, they're picking up their provisions, they're signing on the left, they're signing to say, I'm happy to join up for foreign service. Because at this stage there was no conscription, so these men didn't have to go off for further training, but most of them actually decided to do that. So this was a scene at the back of St. Michael's Hill between the 5th and the 10th or 9th of August 1914. All of George's brothers from his first family fought in the war. Fred, who I mentioned, was a bit of a naughty boy as an 11-year-old. Look at him now, very proud in his South Wales Borderers uniform. And I've come across a lovely postcard that he wrote to his father, almost pleading for forgiveness for how bad he was as an 11-year-old, and finishing up saying, "Now, look at me now." And I think that's a lovely, lovely little story. At the time of the war, when it breaks out, Fred was actually on garrison duty in China, and his battalion linked up with Japanese forces to attack the German garrison at a place called Sin Tao. Tom, at the start of the war with the Border Regiment, was in Burma, and both Tom and Fred were, both Tom and Fred's battalions were hastily brought back to England, ready for further conflict away from China and Burma. Harry used to work at Packer's Chocolate Factory in Whitehall, and he joined the Royal Engineers. So he's quite a technical chap. So that's where Harry went. So all four brothers fought in the war, and I've researched what happened to each of these chaps as well. But one of the stars of the story really is Edith, because although I had George Pine's writings, what I didn't have up until partway through my research was any ephemera. Edith, bless her, she kept a trunk, and that's Edith's trunk, found in a relative's bedroom cupboard that had been there for 30 years. And prior to throwing the trunk out, they realised I was doing research into the Pine family, and they said to me, "Clive, do you want to come over and have a look what's in here? And you're welcome to the content." So I've got that trunk, and inside it were more than 100 items. Basically, Edith kept personal effects relating to her four brothers. And when Edith died in 1943, George Pine inherited that trunk and added more ephemera to that trunk. So when I opened it up, it's one of those eureka moments, really. And it certainly helped in helping to marshal and order George's memories, because there was lots of clues in that trunk which helped me answer some of the threads that George had left unspoken about. So that was Edith. This was the scene, 10th of August 1914, when the 6th Gloucesters left their barracks. St Michael's Hill today looks pretty similar. The only difference is the building near the top on the right, which was the battalion headquarters that I mentioned. As I said, that's now St Michael's Hospital, but everything else, the cobbled stones on the left there, it's all there today. And George Pine is in the middle of that group, leaving Bristol to go on training. And basically there was a lot of, so they left Bristol 10th of August and they headed to Essex. And in those initial weeks of when they left, there was a lot of misinformation, really. Where have the territorials gone? The War Office wasn't giving any information away. But it didn't take long before postcards like the one on the left started to be sent home to relatives. "Oh, that's very useful. Oh, you're near Malden. Oh, you're near Chelmsford in Essex." Basically, the 6th Gloucesters were based in Little Badow, near Chelmsford. The 4th Gloucesters were in the adjoining village called Danbury. And both of those battalions were training in this area for 7 months. And on the right there, you can see what that is. That's a rifle range being constructed by the 6th Gloucesters in Essex. And that's where George and his colleagues stayed, getting ready for what was about to confront them. The day before, the 6th Gloucesters and George left for France. This was a photograph. Basically, they were living in these sorts of huts in Essex. So this was a photograph taken the day before they went to France and Belgium on the 1st of April, 1915. Unfortunately, I didn't find this document for my book, but I found it subsequently, which I'm really pleased about, because there was a publication called Bristol and the War, which came out, first edition was in October 1914, and it went all the way through to June, July 1917. But increasingly, it became difficult for the editors to say too much because of War Office communications restrictions, and paper was running low, newsprint ink was running low, so the rag ended, as I said, June, July 1917. But in the September the 1st edition, 1915, is a letter that Fred Pine, whose photograph was in the newspaper, wrote to his sister, and his stepsister below is Mabel. And basically, Fred talks about what it was like leaving Britain to fight overseas, and he met up with his brother Tom at Avonmouth on a ship. So they hadn't seen each other for years, and he describes in his letter to Mabel what it was like meeting up with Tom, and how they were then with their respective battalions on the way to the Hellas Peninsula, ready for the Gallipoli campaign. So both Fred and Tom fought at Gallipoli, and sadly, when George Pine was home on leave in November 1915, he just found out that Tom had actually been killed on Gallipoli. And in fact, in Fred's letter, he did mention to Mabel that he saw Tom being taken down to the hospital ship for treatment. And what Fred didn't realise was that he actually died on board the hospital ship. A few words about Tom. The top photograph is the landing craft that was about to land on X Beach on the Hellas Peninsula on the 25th of April 1915. Tom will be in that melee somewhere, but as I said, he was killed on the 20th of November, and he was buried from that hospital ship down below, the HM Dongola, and his personal effects were returned to the family by the regimental padre. And these include, and I have them in the collection at home, his common prayer book that he signed his name in. There's also the signature of a chap called Charles Cross, and they were both in the same platoon together on Gallipoli, and they shared the same common prayer book. And I've subsequently found that Charles Cross not only survived Gallipoli, he survived the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Passchendaele as well. So it'd be lovely to reunite the Cross family with that common prayer book one day. It's on my to-do list. Well, sadly, Tom's passed away, but after 8 years service as a territorial, bearing in mind George joined in 1908, after 8 years you were allowed to 1 month's leave. So George took the opportunity to come home to Bristol, and this is in the back garden of 90 Bellevue Road in Easton. Took the opportunity to marry his childhood sweetheart Violet. So this is the wedding photograph from that day, and it shows George's stepbrothers and sisters, and Edith's on there as well. And if it looks like Uncle Bill Radford is holding George up, that's exactly what he's doing, because when the photographer came to take the wedding photographs, George in his memoirs described how embarrassing it was that they had to wake him up because he'd had 1 or 2 drinks too many. So a nice little story. So wake up, George, the photographer's here. So that's the photo of the wedding day. And bearing in mind we're June 1916, George had to return back to the front in early July 1916. Of course, early July 1916, Battle of the Somme. So George went back from this lovely wedding celebration to absolute horror during the battle. He returned to his platoon on about the 9th of July, and where that yellow cross is, basically George was there when he got injured. But prior to actually the 6th Gloucesters coming into the line at Mark Copse, the Accrington Pals on the 1st of July 1917 were trying to capture the town of Serre on the far right, and between that orange or yellow star to Serre, the Accrington Pals lost more than 700 men killed in about an hour and a half to 2 hours. The 6th Gloucesters reinforced the Accrington Pals, and George doesn't describe any blood and gore at all in his memories, but just said the scene that greeted him would stay with him for the rest of his life. So, well, none of us can imagine what that was like, but anyway, it clearly had a massive impact on him. So he was injured by a shell along with 2 others standing at that area. And I guess he was fortunate in a way to get injured then, because by the end of July, 92 of his colleagues had been killed during the battle, and another 307 had been injured. So almost not far from half of battalion strength taken away, casualties in those few weeks. So by the end of July, George is back in England again. Top left is the Much Wenlock War Hospital. It is a voluntary aid detachment hospital during World War One, and the building, that site, looks pretty similar today because it's a residential care home, and one of the bedrooms at the top near the chimneys has been converted into like a little makeshift museum, telling the story of the hospital during World War One. I found some lovely effects relating to George's stay there, including the photograph below, which was the hospital staff, the doctors and nurses who looked after George when he was recuperating. So that was an injury sustained in July 1916. By February 1917, George was deemed well enough to go back out to fight again. Basically, he had lots of hot shrapnel embedded in his backside and down his legs. That was all removed, operated on, and eventually recovered. But he had to go back out to fight. And he actually went out to fight with the 12th Gloucesters, which was another Bristol battalion, nicknamed Bristol's Own. And so George was at Passchendaele in October 1917, when Violet, pictures on the right, gave birth to their first son, also called George Jr. And even though the 12th Gloucesters were not actually in the front line, they were basically supplying ammunition and provisions, food and water to the front line. They suffered 250 casualties in 11 days. They were constantly being bombarded by German artillery. So the battalion was taken out of the front line and sent to Italy for a few months for a bit of recuperation. It was a quieter part of the Western Front, and also to be prepared for more drafts of men to top up the numbers that you had lost. So in Italy for a while, not for too long though, because the Germans launched their last major offensive of World War One, called the Battle or the Spring Offensive, and this was around Lys. So this area here shows the Battle of the Lys, and where the yellow splodge is at the moment is a forest of Neep, and so the 12th Gloucesters joined other British battalions and helped to stop the German advance near the forest. So the thick black line is the British line. After really the German offensive had had stalled a little bit. But German forces made massive advances in the few days before that. That whole area to the right was captured by German forces. And sadly, what George never realized was that his brother Fred was killed the day before George arrived in this area. And where the red mark is now is where Fred was killed. Basically 350 of Fred's battalion was overrun and encircled by German forces, and very few of them came out alive. Very sad. So Fred died then. Just a few words on Fred. He got married in December 1917 to Amy Andrews, and the wedding photograph is on the left. A month before he was killed, I came across a handwritten letter that Fred wrote, and that's the one in the middle. I was researching the story in the South Wales Borderers Museum in Brecon, when the curator rather excitedly came up to me during one of my research visits and said, "Clive, you're not going to believe this. Look what I've just found." And yes, it was a handwritten note by Fred, basically describing an act of bravery of one of his officers. And because of Fred's note and two other notes in the file, the officer, Captain Lewis, was awarded the Military Cross. But sadly, such is the way in war, Fred's body was never recovered. He was down as missing, and the family hoped upon hope that he was taken prisoner of war and might emerge at the end of the war. And right the way through on the far right, we have a news item in the Bristol Times and Mirror from January 1919. Bearing in mind, Fred had died a good 6 months earlier. and the family were appealing for information about their son, what had happened to Fred. But they eventually had a telegram from the War Office to say he's definitely not a prisoner of war. Sadly, Fred would have died in that exchange in front of a Neep forest. Now, going through George's memoirs, this is still the area around Neep Forest where the British were holding the line, where they stopped the advance, but the Germans were sniping into the forest from a set of farm buildings, trying to pick off the British troops holding the line. So the 12th Gloucesters decided to raid the set of German farm buildings across no man's land to capture the farmhouse to stop the sniping. And they basically did that, but not before two of George's officers leading the particular event were killed. George and another sergeant took over as the most senior members of the raiding party, and they eventually captured the buildings, captured 30 German POWs, captured the guns, and for that action, George was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, which is second only to the Victoria Cross. So that medal and George's other medals are on display at M Shed, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. He was also made up to Company Sergeant Major, which was the highest rank a non-commissioned officer could get. So August 1918, he was Company Sergeant Major for his battalion. Getting to the end of World War I now, September 1918, the British forces were making huge advances. Basically, the German forces had put so much effort into their spring offensive, they'd gone beyond their supply lines, they weren't successful in their objectives, and the tide had turned. And of course, around about this time, the Western Front was bolstered by the arrival of American forces as well. So the strength of the logistics gradually pushed the Germans back. And in Edith's trunk, I came across George's pay books from 1917 and 1918. And this is George's pay book from 1918. The last entry was the 26th of September 1918, when George was paid 40 French francs. And it would be about 4 months before George saw that pay book again and the money that was inside, because I'll let you read what comes up on the screen next. So poor old George, gunshot wound to the back of the head, bullet wound or a bullet in the shoulder. And in his memoirs, he describes how he couldn't understand when he came to after 18 hours in a shell hole, couldn't understand why he couldn't see very well. So he got back to British lines by following the sound of British artillery. He knew what the artillery sounded like, so he headed towards where those guns were being fired, and he eventually got back to help and taken to a dressing station. And this was actually the number 6 ambulance train that removed George from the battlefield and took him to an Australian military hospital in Rouen, where the bullet in George's shoulder was removed. And he was quickly taken to a hospital ship that brought him into Southampton, and then a hospital train brought George back to Bristol. And this was the scene, typical scene at platform 6 at Templemead Station, where 400 hospital trains came into Bristol during World War I. And it was one up, one down. You can see those stretchers. There's a patient on top, and there will be a patient underneath as well. And the hospital ambulances were so designed to push those stretchers as they were into the back of a hospital, in the back of an ambulance. Now, George, luckily for him, really, was taken to Beaufort War Hospital at Fishponds, and George is middle row, far left, sat next to the first nurse you can see on the left. And he looks quite well, that lovely, in his hospital blues. And he's 4 months in hospital, honorably discharged in January 1919. But because of his head injury, mostly, he was assessed as 50% disabled, because the trouble he had getting out of that shell hole and seeing anything, basically the bullet went to the back of his neck, really impacted on his optical nerve and gave him backaches and headaches all of his life, and clearly impacted on his vision, which wasn't great, but he wasn't blinded, but his vision wasn't brilliant. Now, a word about Harry. Haven't said much about Harry Pine yet. As I mentioned, he was in the Royal Engineers. He actually emigrated to Australia in 1920. And there he is, pictured in the middle there in the 1930s, drinking from the amber nectar, by the looks of it, on a rabbit shoot. And there he is on the far right, in the outside or in the back of the Royal Hotel in a place called Crookwell. And he actually died in a stable block in the Royal Hotel in 1963, as I've subsequently found out. And he was one of the many soldier drifters that were around Australia at the time. A lot of men who couldn't really cope with regular life afterwards. And I found out he was living at a place called Cotterwalla in a hut in the backyard, but very well looked after by any of the sort of farmers and agricultural workers that they come across. So one day I'd love to go across to Crookwell and tell George Harry's story as well. Now, moving into 1919, 1920, very difficult period right across the country. And in Bristol, this is on the centre, there were lots of concern about how returning servicemen, and particularly those who were disabled, what sort of jobs, what sort of life could they pick up again after the war? Very difficult for lots of them. Not many jobs going. Some employers couldn't keep open the jobs that they promised the men when they came back. And of course, you had the Spanish pandemic, which was unfortunately killing a lot of people all over the country at that time. So really tough times. And in Bristol, part of that came to a head really when some tram services and some tram depots were attacked by men demanding that the Bristol Tramways and Carriage Company sack their female employees that they employed to make, because of the men were fighting abroad, to sack them. And eventually, after a lot of pressure over 2 or 3 weeks, that's exactly what they did. There were nearly 500 female employees who were mostly employed as tram conductresses, who were given their marching orders basically and paid £5 severance money to free up space for some of the returning servicemen. And that is really the main reason why George Pine managed to get a job after World War II. He was too unwell to go back to the boot and shoe trade. He tried it, but he collapsed in St George's Park on his way to work one day. He just couldn't cope with the shaking and the noise of the machinery. But there's no help for people returning servicemen at all. And in his memoirs, he said of that incident when he collapsed, "Come on, George, pull yourself together." Now, he's wounded 3 times during the battle and during the First World War, and he's telling himself to pull himself together. So quite extraordinary, really. But here's George standing on the footplate of this tram on the Downs. He became a tram conductor on service number 3 from Eastville to Durham Downs. And I got this photograph from Peter Davies' personal collection when I met Peter many years ago. So it was nice to come across this image. And the driver apparently is a driver called Smash Shepherd. I guess he wasn't a very good driver in that regard. Anyway, George is now a tram conductor, and this was George's tram at the top of Black Boy Hill, tram number 31, the Eastville tram. Lovely image of a tram at the top of Black Boy. And he also went on particular excursions. So if the Campbell's steamers were coming into Bristol or going out of Bristol, more often than not, they would pick up passengers on trams. And this lovely image here of people waiting for the trams all along the Portway. And a lot of the time they go up the Clifton Rocks Railway up to Clifton to do their shopping before coming back down, jumping on the tram and going back to either Ilfracombe or along the Somerset coast, or more often than not over to Cardiff and Barry, those sorts of places. Now, moving the story on a little bit, in 1938, the Tramways Company started the process of moving from trams to double-deck buses. And George's service was the first to transfer, so George became a conductor on a double-deck bus. And that caused him a few kind of mobility problems, really. Slightly narrower stairway than the tram. And also, George, in his memoirs, bearing in mind he was a conductor from 1920, he conducted pretty much for 20, 24, 25 years. He always refused promotions to a driver. On a lot of occasions, he was encouraged, "Go on, George, you're a great conductor. You ought to be a driver," because he knew full well the extent of his war injuries, and he would fail the driver's test. And if he failed the driver's test, he would have been sacked at that time. So he always stayed a conductor when he was on kind of operational duties. All of Bristol's trams, apart from a few destroyed in the Blitz in 1941, were scrapped at Kingswood Depot to make way for the double-deck buses. And sadly, not one Bristol tram was saved. Although, if you're ever fortunate enough to go into Peter Davies' garage in Henleys, he's got so much ephemera you can probably build one with what he's got there. Here's one of George's buses. This is a double-deck bus on George's routes. This is White Ladies Road. Suffered a nasty bomb blast. Fortunately, nobody was killed or wounded in that particular event. But sadly, 44 people died at Broadweir in Old Market in August 1942, when a single daylight raid above Bristol dropped one bomb, and it blew up a car which sent all of its spray into 3 buses. And so 3 buses were destroyed, and unfortunately many people were burnt alive on those buses. 3 of George's colleagues were killed in this event, and he would have been there had he not been on a slightly different shift. He was actually on the Downs, on his way down to the centre at the time. Moving on to George's retirement now, he transferred from a double-deck bus to that single-deck bus on the right there in Carey's Lane, just off of Old Market, number 83. So he was a conductor, still a conductor for a few more years, but he still suffered constantly from his war injuries, head pains. He had to have regular lumbar punctures, and every year he had a couple of spells in specialist hospitals in Oxfordshire. But the Tramways Company were very good to him and eventually transferred him to an admin job at Lawrence Hill. Basically, it was the driving school at Lawrence Hill. So he was an administrator in the office there, where George stayed until his retirement in 1956. 10 years later, the Pines moved house. Lovely photograph of George and his wife on the far left, which was in the Bristol Evening Post, celebrating their 50th anniversary. They moved house into a prefab in Frenchay, but shortly afterwards, his wife Violet passed away. And so George, in 1967, moved to the elderly person's home in Southmead, where he stayed until his death in 1972. And he passed away in the company of these fine ladies, had a massive heart attack and died immediately. And it was after that George's manuscript emerged, and how I was able then to research it, tell his story, write a book, and give this presentation to your good selves. So that's all from me. Thank you very much. Very happy to answer any questions, and I'll stop sharing now.
You're all muted, so as to not interrupt the presentation. So if you all unmute now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that was. I found that really interesting. It reminded me very much of a lot of the things. I grew up in Swindon, and my parents were in Swindon through the war, and so a lot of photographs and pictures reminded me very much of some of the ones I've inherited from my father. So very, very, very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thank
Patsy.
you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. No, pleasure. Well, I mean, I've become so interested in this part of Bristol's history now that I've written another couple of books. One called Bravo Bristol with Eugene Byrne, who writes in the Bristol Times. Also written a book called Bristol's Lost City about a huge international exhibition in Bristol in 1914. And I also run tours to the Western Front battlefields once a year. So I take a group of people, local people, across to Belgium and France. And our next one is October 2023. If anybody would like to join me, you'd be more than welcome.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
The photographs really bring it alive. You know, it's great that you were able to get hold of so many, and it kind of brings it home to you another age.
Yeah, definitely. And and once you start digging, it is amazing how much does come out of the woodwork. And like all things, whenever you publish anything, and I've kind of realised this now. I was a bit upset at the time when people came to me with more stories about what I've just written. But of course, they wouldn't have come to me with their stories had they not seen the book. So eventually, you kind of get over that, really, and then you just absorb it. And then what I try to do is bring that into these talks. So I try to change the talk every time I give it, really.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, thank you very much.
A pleasure.
I'm not too great on questions, so I'll let someone else ask your question next while I think about it.
Well, it's fascinating to sort of get more history on Bristol and to see, to see the involvement of people in, charting the lives of their families. Your story was billed as the life of a Tommy. What is a Tommy? I'm still not quite sure what that is.
It should have said the life of a Bristol Tommy.
Oh, Tommy. Right. Okay.
Oh, okay.
I can correct that then, can't I? That's,
yes, please.
Sorry,
that's
that was
good. So we have a misspelling we can put right.
what it was I didn't quite catch exactly what the word was initially, so I put the first announcements about the talk were incorrect, and then I did correct it later when I worked it. I thought, oh, you idiot,
Great.
all of a sudden everything fell into place. So,
I think I prefer that name. I think I'll change it now and see if anybody notices.
One thing that struck was that it's still sort of topical in some ways. As I was looking at the pictures of the trenches and everything, I was thinking of Ukraine. And people are saying it's just like World War I out there. They've got actual trench warfare. And so, terrible to relate, but it's not an ancient history that's disappeared. This is what's happening to people even now.
No, exactly. And you've got the entrenchment, haven't you? You've got almost, you can see a mirror, can't you, where both the forces are now the stalemate and are stuck in that. Here we go again. It's dreadful, absolutely dreadful.
Yeah, the French always have a word for it. They say the plus ça change, plus the moment shows. Unfortunately, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So I agree with David. The absolute horror, that the most intelligent so-called mammal on the planet can do what it does. It's horrible.
The friends and I went once to Avebury to see all the stones that were there, which are quite ancient. And we also went to the church, which was there. And in the church, there was this vast plaque of all the people from those villages, men who were in villages who had died during the conflict. And we all thought, that's decimated the village. There could have been no kind of working men left left in those villages. So you had women and small children, you know, and that must have been kind of devastating for areas like that.
Oh yeah, it would have been, absolutely. David, are you picking up any comments in chat? Are there any questions in chat? Or is that...
Oh, that's normally a good point. Harriet has a recurring disease of not being able to speak. She's not mute. It's Harriet is a technological mute. So sorry, sound not working of exactly. So it reminds me of stories about my family men in World War I. And then she says, "You have so much detail. My granny lost her first husband on the front after my aunt born. Then she married his cousin and had my dad. Lots of letters, etc. Some are in the Imperial War Museum now."
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
that has to be true across the country with, you know,
Yeah.
stuff handed down and discovered in trunks, and,
Yeah.
and the occasional family historian says, "I'm going to do something with this."
Yes.
What was your motivation, Clive? I mean, obviously it's your family and everything, but were you an author before, or?
No, I think it, I guess it comes back to when I was 19, and I had two choices to make. I could either become a history teacher, so I had a place at Cheltenham Teacher Training College, or I could go as a trainee and work for a business trainee with Wessex Water, you know, the local water company. And I was kind of weighing up those two options in my career, and I went down the corporate line. But I've never lost, I loved my history at school, never lost my, Anton Bantok was my history teacher. Some people might back out. Now I'm kind of coming back to.
So we're just suffering. It's the line's gone wonky.
Research really the think, and because it was a fan connection, and because, like you said, because somebody had to do something.
We're
Yes,
we're experiencing Zoom technical problems. Clive, you blanked out. Your head stopped moving and your voice broke up during that answer. Can you hear me now?
I can now. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
and we can hear you. Can you go through that answer again, because we missed it?
Yeah, sure. I think the motivation really was I always loved my history at school. My history teacher was a guy called Anton Bantok at Bedminster Down Secondary School. And for me, it was like probably coming back to my real core interest, which is local history and writing. And I think once I wrote my first book, that, you know, Trenches to Trams, my career has gone off in a completely different direction now, because I've set up a book publishing company called Bristol Books with three of the chaps who helped me with Trenches to Trams. And so now I write and publish books. So it's it was the sort of, you know, the start of that journey, really.
Brilliant. So, and are you documenting that journey as well? So, are you writing about your own personal history?
Well, we all think we don't really have much to say, do we? But it's but actually, funny enough, I have got a folder on my laptop called Before Memoirs Fade. And in it, I am loading up images from my life and anecdotes. So one day I can maybe put pen to paper for the grandchildren.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we've all got lives that deserve to be deserve to be told to someone, even if nobody's listening. So what?
Well, and this what we're doing here is a part of that. I mean, we're getting story after story from people that we would absolutely not otherwise capture, right?
Yeah.
Unless we had this. And that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had lockdown and thought, what are we going to do? and started this, but we've continued it because, you know, it's not a huge group, but we're recording bits of history and people's ideas. And we're learning more about each other than we would ever know by attending Quaker meetings together and sitting in silence in a circle.
No, well, fair play to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the people who I would recommend anybody to listen to is the unveiling, the revealing story of Jenny Smith and her amazing life, and others who are here today who might blush when I say they should have their books published, but the stories, as David said, which we have had, just are quite stunning. Harriet has put in the chat, what kind of books do you publish?
Well, if you go onto our website, is www.bristolbooks.org, and have a look at our titles. But basically, we've produced 30 books now in 10 years, and it's a range of local Bristol books. So they're very well designed, very well written. We've written a book called Bristol's Pauper Children, for example, by Shirley Hodgson. It's an eclectic mix, but they have to have in common to do with Bristol, people, places, and events. So they all have to have a Bristol focus. And we also work with Bristol Museum Service and have produced 3 of their museum guides. So we've produced the Art Gallery Guide, the M-Shed Guide, and the Bristol Museum Guide at Queen's Road as well. And that's what we like to do. We love working with heritage organisations, and we love to enrich the sort of culture of the city through our books, really. So, but they're all pretty much non-fiction. We might dabble a little bit in fiction further down the line, but mostly individuals, community groups, and corporate organisations will ask us to do books on their behalf. We don't make any money out of books, but we just love doing it.
Great.
My question is, are you going to produce a second edition of your book? And my comment, if I can go on, is that I'm in the process now of going through letters I've received and sent, and photographs, notes of meetings for the various groups I've been associated with over the last 50 years. And most of it is going into recycling. I don't think anybody is going to write my biography. I'm certainly not going to do it myself. It's interesting the extent to which your ability to write this book has depended on what other people might consider junk and thrown away. So please, friends, be careful what you throw out. Someone may write your biography and really depend on all the stuff you've accumulated.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's certainly an observation. Will we do a second edition of the book? No, I don't think we will. I think the print run originally was 3,000, and I think there's about 1,000 books left. Anyway, and it didn't do it to make any money, obviously. It's a very expensive process to do a book like that one, and I think I'm quite happy to embellish the story in talks, really, rather than go back to the printed. I would have done things slightly differently, but not a lot. So I'm quite happy with how it turned out, even though it's the core story won't change, it won't date, but I could always embellish. And I think the danger is you wouldn't get the sales second time round. And I just think, no, I've got other projects to beaver away on, really. But no, a good point about not throwing things away, or you know, because what is, you know, and that happens an awful lot. And during lots of my talks, I do say I'm still a volunteer at Bristol Archives. I'm on the Bristol Museum Friends Committee, and I do say to people, you know, always take things down the archive to start with, because, you know, that's a great place for documents and photographs to end up. And who knows, further down the line, when somebody's researching that folder, it might just answer a question that they want to put in a book, or just even answer a question, you know.
I think I'm sorry. I think something that is going on at present culturally, and that I find very worrying, is my daughter. She's in her 50s, and she's always telling me I keep too much, and it's this word stuff. You know, there's too much stuff. And you give them presents, and they say, "It's very nice, Mummy, but it's all this stuff." And I'm thinking, and I'm looking guiltily into my cupboards and my shelves, and I'm thinking of all the things that I think are really important and interesting, and are going to get called stuff that are going to be going out towards the bins. I didn't actually know. Where was this, the archive you mentioned?
Bristol Archives down on the Cumberland Basin system. You know those big red brick bonded warehouses?
Yes, yes.
One of those is called B Bond, and that is the site of Bristol Archives, and the Create Centre is on that site. And it's got a search room, and it's where even you know, the 1273 Bristol Charter is in there in the strong room. So they don't accept everything, obviously, but it's worth, if you've got material Bristol related, it's a great place for items to end up.
Right.
And I've got boxes to get boxes of stuff to be deposited with the archives in the new year. So
yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Well, nice to see you, Harriet. We can see you now, but.
Are you going to be repaired soon, Harriet? Are we looking to a repair before too long?
Now writing.
We miss you. A Merry Christmas and some better computing stuff.
Wow.
I've had it fixed 5 times. You need a proper fix. So this is, I mean, we've learned a lot about technology, but we're beginners mostly in this sort of. But you know, we've got our little collection of videos on YouTube, and it's wonderful to have these people, you know, basically prepared to join us for a chat of a Friday morning, and to learn something of the history or their thinking. We've got a whole series of Jennies. So on our cumulative playlist, you can find Jenny's latest one, and that will link through to all the others.
Well, if any of you live near Backwell, then I'll be in Parker's estate agent later this afternoon, selling some books. So you're welcome to swing by.
Great.
Oh, that'd be nice. Yeah.
That one.
Okay,
They would make very nice Christmas presents, I would suggest. Actually,
I couldn't agree more, Patsy. And it's mates rates for Quakers, so they're double the price now. So,
Great.
it's just gone up.
Oh, that's rather unfortunate for you, Harriet.
Harriet's saying the new laptop Zoom microphone says it's working, and it is not. You should, if it's a new laptop, you should be able to take it back to where you got it and have a chat with the people about it. Yeah, we can see your frustration on screen.
I like that quote, which my brother used, and I use unshamelessly a lot of the time now. It's for people like that. And he said, you know, I would like to shake them warmly by the throat. Very unquakerly, but
You could say it was sort of friendly, couldn't you?
anyway, any more questions and comments for Clive, friends? And if that's the case, then I would, as the Americans would say, wish you all a good day.
Thank you very much
And
indeed.
you. Thank you. Thank you.
Lovely to
Thank
meet you all.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, thank you, Clive.
Thank you.
Lovely
Thank you.
meeting you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.